Time news now from Moscow. This week, Turkey makes gangster threats. The U.S. and Russia bomb each other with blame, and a senior Israeli terror negotiator is in the now. Turkey is throwing some pretty heavy threats around Europe. A leaked record of a high-level meeting shows President Erdogan used the refugee crisis to raise his stakes. Top European officials offered some money to help deal with refugees. But Erdogan wanted more and threatened to, quote, put refugees on buses and flood Europe if not. As if the problem wasn't worse enough, take a look at this. Scientific American, well, they put data on refugee migration to Europe over the last 4 years into some perspective. Look at the difference here compared to 2015. The time slows down, and just look at that flow. Incredible. Joining us in the now is Jeremy Salt. He's a former professor of Mideast Studies at Bilkent University, speaking to us on the line today from Ankara. Professor Salt, given all that we've just mentioned, does Europe have a choice? Doesn't Erdogan have the upper hand here, and he can basically dictate the rules?
If I can just make one point first about the number of refugees in Syria and coming out of Syria. After the Americans invaded Iraq, it was said by the UN that the refugee flow was the worst since the Palestine War of 1948. Now that has been surpassed by the refugee flow as a result of the Syrian war. There are now 11 million people either displaced inside their own country or fleeing outside the borders of their country into Lebanon, into Turkey, and into Jordan. So this is an absolutely massive problem. Insofar as Turkey is concerned and its relations with the European Union, it would seem to me that there's something of a stalemate because the European countries physically can't really take in any more refugees. Turkey itself has got 2 million Syrians within its border, several hundred thousands in camps, and the bulk of them actually scratching out a living as best as they can across the country. And I think that Mr. Erdogan's statements coming out of a very, very powerful sense of anger and frustration at what's happened over Syria, because the Syria policy that he formulated with Mr. Davutoglu 5 years ago has completely collapsed, and Turkey seems to be snookered on every front in its dealings with the EU. It has problems in its dealings with the Americans over the Syrian Kurds. Nothing is going right for Turkey right now, and I think that Mr. Erdogan's apparent explosion of anger at the UN and at the EU over the refugee situation is a result of that.
Is Turkey doing a lot to hold back this flow of refugees?
Well, the European Union and the UN would say that Turkey could do more, that in particular it should be doing more along the Aegean coast. Turkey argues that in fact that's not feasible, that the coastline is too long and it simply cannot police every kind of section of the Aegean coast and stop people smugglers from taking people out. And of course, as we know, many hundreds of them are drowning in the Aegean. So once again, there are two kind of opposed positions here. The Europeans saying you can do more, and Turkey saying actually we can't do any more, and what you're asking us to do is not feasible.
You've already pointed out the severity of the refugee crisis for the Europeans. Can Turkey use that to dictate negotiations?
Well, there's in the give and take that's been taking place over the last few weeks between the European Union and Turkey. We know what the Europeans said. They more or less said that, look, we'll give you the money, $3 billion, just if you keep the refugees inside your own borders. And this is a very rather selfish attitude to take, in the sense that the European Union could have said, well, we want conditions, we want an end to your support for armed groups inside Syria. We want the war to be wound down so it's not generating any more refugees. In fact, it didn't do that. All it was doing was thinking of itself and saying, here's the money if you keep the refugees inside Turkey. Now, Turkey was pledged $3 billion. Now, Mr. Erdogan has asked for a further $3 billion for the second year. So these negotiations are continuing, and we have to wait a little while to see how they're going to play out.
Speaking of the the Syrian conflict in particular, Turkey says that Kurds are terrorists. They label them this way. At the same time, the Kurds are fighting ISIS terrorists. This means that, according to Ankara's logic, terrorists are fighting terrorists. Can you expand on that for us?
Well, terrorist and terrorism are words that are thrown around according to self-interest. The United States, for example, disagrees with Turkey over the definition of the main Syrian Kurdish political party, the Kurdish Democratic Union, as a terrorist grouping. Turkey says it is, and the United States very publicly has said that it's not. And in fact, it's working with this group, which in fact has just opened an office in Moscow. So there is, once again, here we have another situation in which Turkey is at loggerheads, even with the United States, over who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist. So it's a very selective kind of business, the use of language in this conflict in Syria.
Could Turkey take more of a stand if they did more to fight ISIS?
Well, I think that Turkey's, as I said before, Turkey's position in Syria is almost completely collapsed, particularly since the opening of the Russian air offensive. And Turkey's hopes, I think, some years ago were that Aleppo would become the capital of a liberated North Syria. Well, in fact, that didn't happen. It's never going to happen now because Aleppo is very close to being liberated by the Syrian army. The city is completely enclosed, almost completely enclosed by the Syrian army or the Kurds. Even the Islamic State, those units that are stationed near Aleppo, have been cut off from their base in Raqqa. So there's not a great deal that Turkey can do right now to change the momentum of events, and its kind of accusations of its relationship with ISIS is somewhat secondary, because the whole scene is it kind of doesn't lend itself to any change on the part of Turkey. There's not a great deal it can do to change the momentum, unless it's prepared to take a great risk by trying to establish a no-fly zone across the border. And everyone knows that would be extremely risky because it might bring on an open confrontation with Russia.
I want to just finally bring in Saudi Arabia, because there's been a lot of reports circulating about possibility of ground troops in Syria. If that happens, what does that mean for this conflict and the cocktail of interests and countries that will then have been involved?
I don't think anyone really takes this seriously. I mean, any commitment of Saudi troops would be very small. We know that Saudi Arabia has launched a war in Yemen, which not only it can't win, but has resulted in its own territory being taken by the Houthi rebels. So Saudi Arabia is in an extremely poor position. And for it to say this, and we know what the response was of the Syrian foreign minister, that anyone who comes from Saudi Arabia or other countries, ground troops, they're going to return in wooden coffins. And for Saudi Arabia, which has done a lot over the last 5 years, as much as almost as anyone, to destroy the Syrian government, for it to say we're going to now send ground troops into Syria, is grotesque. And of course, their presence, if they do come, and I doubt that very much, would be very strongly resisted by the Syrian government.
Jeremy Salt, a former professor of Middle East Studies at the University of Bill Kent. Thanks so much for being in the Now.
Thank you.
A Belgian reporter groped live on TV in Germany.
A reporter for a Belgian television station was kissed, taunted and inappropriately touched while doing her report. She yelled at the men and they eventually fled. Hundreds of women in Cologne claimed they were groped or robbed on New Year's Eve. Many blamed Arab or North African-looking men. The reporter in the latest case said the men spoke German.
Ah, those migrants again, you might be thinking. But no, have a closer look. These men are white, clearly white Europeans. And you would never know because the media hides them. Some blurring faces and all blurring lines. They don't say migrants, refugees did either, but there's zero mention that the attackers were European looking. But they do make parallels with mass sexual attacks in Cologne on New Year's Eve, just to make sure that's what stays in your head, attacks by Arab and North African-looking men. Well, the TV channel itself refused to publish the video due to ethical concerns, which is fine. But would it be the same if the attackers were not white? I'm pretty sure the video would have been viral by now. Syria, a war made worse by an information war. French viewers, the latest casualty.
Les avions de la coalition, ils manquent de cibles. Ils frappent des centres d'entraînement, de commandement, des endroits où sont stockées des armes, du matériel, mais des cibles parfois cachées, enterrées, très difficiles à repérer. On essaye aussi de frapper au portefeuille les sites pétroliers exploités par le groupe État islamique et dont plusieurs ont déjà été détruits.
France, too, wants people to believe U.S. strikes in Syria are good and Russian airstrikes are bad. So much so that they had to use footage of Russian airstrikes to illustrate their point. Clearly easy to verify on the Russian Defense Ministry's official YouTube page. I know, a bit desperate. Surely there are videos of U.S. airstrikes, but it gets even worse.
Puis les consignes des états-majors, elles sont claires, faire le moins de victimes civiles possible.
They want you to believe Russian anti-terror strikes are killing civilians, but U.S. strikes don't. Magic bombs. While the U.S. and Russia go back and forth about bombs and blame, there is one thing they can agree on. That is terror threats and how real they are. Both countries have lost thousands of citizens in terror attacks. Iron fist, that's how they deal with terrorists. No talks, no ransom, no tolerance. Kill, eliminate, exterminate, the only option here. Some countries do yield to terrorist demands, though. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Sweden pay ransoms to hostage takers, including ISIS. Israel talks to terrorists and offers concessions. Coming up, we go inside the head of a man who negotiates with terrorists. He studies their psychology and knows exactly what they want and when there's nothing that can change their minds. Stay in the Now.
Most Americans, frankly, don't know who this guy is.
Bernie is so old school, socialist, a radical guy.
Oh my gosh, it's a real threat to Hillary.
It's kind of cute because you know it's never going to go anywhere.
The left-wing candidate has been heavily supported across the country.
We've actually never had a prominent left. Bernie Sanders could change that.
Labels are becoming less important than ideas.
Bernie Sanders is igniting a flame of voter support.
The race for the Democratic nomination tightens.
And the gap between them nationally is closing.
Bernie Sanders, George, has a good shot at winning the White House in November.
If you are born in the village, like my village, and you have the color which I have, for sure, you have to suffer. People think that we do not die. People are being hunting us. People are being chopped our body parts. We are being isolated because of our skin color.
Uncovering hidden stories, moving against the mainstream, going to all lengths to bring real news to Britain. I'm Afshin Ratansi, going underground to bring you the stories that really matter, only on RT.
Do you like the taste of bananas? "80 years ago, bullets were the tool in the struggle for monopoly. After the rivers of blood came rivers of poison."
That massacre is the great-great-great-grandfather of the massacres, the deaths, the devastation that's going on now.
Today, producers don't bother with protecting anything but their profits.
Estamos trabajando y pasan las avionetas. A veces el líquido nos cae y nos arde el cuerpo. Si nos caen las vistas, nos arde.
Yo a cada rato escuchaba las avionetas encima mía, que jin, jin, jin. Si alguien nos hubiera educado que esta situación de la fumigación perjudicaba a los niños, estando en embarazo o a los niños, yo me hubiera ido, no hubiera desaparecido de aquí, pero nunca tuve ese conocimiento.
What is the actual price of delicious fruit?
me in the Now is Monte Cristo, one of Israel's leading negotiation experts. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, good evening.
I know of late you've been coming to Russia often. The rise of ISIS in the Middle East, Boko Haram in Africa, terrorism is real. It's probably always been real for you. But it's different now. It's spread. It's spread. It's strong. Times have changed. How does it happen when we see hostage crisis? Obviously, it depends in the area you are, of how common they are. France recently, it's become a reality for them.
We have to bear in mind that hostage negotiation is a crisis negotiation. It's a form of terrorist activity that changed throughout the years. When you address the issue of hostage negotiation in a professional manner, one of the most important things is, first of all, to identify what is the motivation of the terrorists that either took hostages or barricade themselves in a scene. We professionally tend to differentiate between an instrumental motivation and an expressive motivation. Instrumental motivation is that there is a certain trade-off, there is a certain purpose, there is a certain something that the terrorists do want, usually a release of prisoners, or some other instrumental request. On the other side, we speak about expressive motivation. Expressive motivation is that the main purpose of the terrorist is to air their brutal actions, to air their cause.
So this would be like Bataclan in
this
France, yes?
would be like Bataclan, but this would also be like Nordost in 2003, or Beslan here in Moscow with the Chechen terrorists. The purpose was to make a point. The demands or the requests of the terrorists were completely irrelevant. The same with the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the jihadist barricade and hostage situation in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Sydney, Australia, ISIS Café Lind, and in France.
You've mentioned a couple of attacks that have happened of late and around the world. You also mentioned ones that have happened quite some time ago. Do tactics change? Your negotiators' tactics change over the years?
I think that the most important change that happened over the year is the use of social media and the use of media when you encounter this type of event. In the past, security forces could have blocked the scene and to some extent control the information flow out of the scene. Many times they also could have blocked the information that goes into the barricaded scene to the terrorists or monitor them. Today, with the spread of social networks and media and everything, it is very, very difficult because sometimes the terrorists, because they do want to amplify the terror impact, they post YouTube videos or take pictures, or the media is hacking into the security camera of the mall, and they spread. So the amplifying effect of the terror attack today is much more challenging to deal with.
Does it hamper anti-terror measures or help it essentially? Because I'm sure it helps intel as well.
It helps the intel, but in this expressive behavior, expressive events, the intelligence that is required is usually a tactical intelligence rather than intelligence to understand the motives and maybe negotiate a better deal. Most of the time, professionally wise, when there is a barricade situation, once we understand that there is no trade-off, that's not an instrumental event, we would recommend as a negotiator to the police forces to storm. And this is what the French police didn't do in the recent attacks, only in the last one, in Bataclan, when it was very clear that it is ISIS. It was very clear that they're not holding the hostages for trade purposes.
To kill them.
And even then, it took a lot of time to the police. In Hyper Cacher, just a year before, the same. It took the police a lot of time to understand that this is not a classic hostage situation that you negotiate with the terrorist.
Negotiate, I just want to clarify, negotiating doesn't necessarily mean making a deal.
Exactly.
Can you explain that?
Yeah.
Because I think people might confuse the two.
That's very good, and thanks for asking this question, because when people say we don't negotiate with terrorists, what actually they mean is that we don't want to give in, we don't want to cut a deal.
Which is the policy of Russia, the United States.
Which is the policy of many countries in the world. Israel, of course, is an exception. Yeah, we do not come to an agreement with terrorists, even though America secretly, confidentially
has made
a lot of deals with
like with the Taliban.
Yeah, with the terrorists. Yeah, but that's again the question.
Every country has exceptions.
Every country has exception. Every country.
So what does negotiating mean if you don't make a deal? It means,
well, without entering into too many operational secrets, I would say that most of the time you negotiate for time. That time allows you understand the situation. Time allows you gather the forces. Time allows you to gain some impact, to access maybe more family members of the terrorist. The first 1 hour, 2 hours depends on the quality and the experience and the capacities of the police forces. Nigeria or Kenya are not the security forces in Russia or US or Israel, not even the Australians. There are changes. But usually in crisis event, it takes a lot of time to understand what's going on. How many hostages, how many terrorists, what do they want, whether they have explosive, what type of explosive they have. If they were themselves suicide bomb with maybe chemical gas or something, that would require security forces to deal the events in a different way.
What do you say to a terrorist to get them to surrender? And what's your main priority during negotiations? I know that's a tough question.
No, surrender is one way to end up the siege or the event. No one really professionally believes that the terrorists, definitely the fundamentalists, the jihadists, will walk out surrendering, singing hallelujah.
This happens in movies.
Yeah, exactly. They are in a certain psychological mindset, and they actually want to commit suicide. They want to istishhad. They want to kill themselves, okay? And they want to kill themselves with as many cameras as possible around. They want to amplify the terror impact.
Is this a new form of terrorism?
That's a new, it's what depends how you define
relatively modern. And this is not something we would see in Israel
in the
20 years ago.
No, that is not that we would have seen 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It started with the rise of fundamentalists after 9/11 to some extent.
Iraq War, maybe.
Iraq War, Taliban, the jihadists that spread. That was, these people, when they barricade themselves, they just want to amplify the istishhad, the martyrism impact. In order to do that, they want to barricade themselves, they want to kill as many people. In Delhi, they kept the event 3 days in the media. That's a lot of time to allow their colleagues to recruit people.
And this is what they wanted.
This is what they wanted.
So was that a negotiation mistake?
That was an operational I don't want to call it mistake because I was not there, and I'm very careful in choosing the words. It took, for the Indian security forces, it took a lot of time to understand what's the event, because the terrorists there, they were very sophisticated and they did negotiate. They negotiate pretending as it is an instrumental event. They killed in Chabad house, they killed the Jewish family there, but they continue to negotiate as if they want something. It was a very high level of sophistication, operated from outside. The ISIS people usually are less sophisticated. They really want to do this mass killing with maximum media. We have to understand their mind. They're not into surrender. They're not into surrender. Israel captured many terrorists, relatively many terrorist attacks during in the previous decade that the bomb didn't operate, that they pushed the button and nothing happened. And through understanding, I don't even want to use the word interrogation, because it was through understanding the mindset, the motives, we learned a lot about the profile of these suicide attackers. Some of them are into this religious fundamentalist mindset, and they want to kill as many infidels.
What can you do to fight terrorism if there's nothing to convince these people or stop them or rationalize? There's no rationalization here. There is no negotiation.
No, there is no negotiation for the ultimate cause. There is no political negotiations. We will never be able to fight ISIS, to negotiate with ISIS a deal, not even an instrumental deal to calm down. Terrorism has to be fought in a comprehensive strategy that includes go after the leaders, go after the money, go after the terrorists. I'll tell you, from a counterterrorism perspective, ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, ISIS at least have a territory. This is why the international...
Which doesn't say much about the coordinates of a global fight against terror, does it?
No, it doesn't.
So you seem to not think that that's going well, which a lot of people would argue it's not.
It's, well, terrorism, global, the jihadism is a global phenomenon that needs to be confronted with a very comprehensive strategy. This is why the coordination between the forces and the superpowers in Syria is extremely important. You have to go to the mosques, you have to go to the imams, you have to go to the neighborhoods, you have to go after the money, you have to go physically target killing the leaders, you have to dry the money, you have to go into the bank accounts, okay? And you have in parallel to provide some sort of a political horizon to the population that supports them. There is a huge debate whether fundamentalism can grow on any surface. In my perspective, no. You need to have this poverty, sense of isolation, sense of defeat. There is another interesting angle to look at global terrorism and what happens with Islam today is examining the age of the culture. Islam, age-wise, is in the age that the Christianity was in the very dark days of the Inquisition. Very brutal, very violent. The Inquisition in Europe was not a peaceful regime, human rights pursued. And this is, in terms of age of religion, this is where Islam is now, because I think 2015 was the first year, and I might be wrong with the details, but 2015, all the terrorist attack, the suicide terrorist attack was conducted by Islamic fundamentalists. So,
right, I'm gonna have to stop you there. Very, very interesting comments, really. Monty Crystal, CEO of Negotiation Strategies based in Israel. Thank you so much for coming in. Really, really interesting way of looking at the global situation.
Thank you
from
very
behind
much.
the scenes. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anissa. Bye-bye.
That does it for me this week. Send your comments and story ideas to our Facebook and Twitter pages. I want to leave you on a lighter note. Here's some fun from India. I'll see you next week. And remember, it's now or never.